God puts us in nations, in places, not by mistake, but to do a job. What if we opened our eyes to the needs of our colleagues, of our leaders, of our subordinates, and we were a priest on their behalf? Welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson.
And I'm Lynn Johnson.
And we're going to be talking about how to get our business into God's business world. So thank you for joining us this week and every week on the Repurposing Business Podcast. Well, welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. What a delight to have Katrina and Curt Laird with us. Guys, thank you so much for taking time.
Such a joy. Happy to be here.
Good to be here.
Yeah, this is like a double blessing when I get two people, a healthy, good-looking, functional couple who are doing amazing things.
Slightly less healthy, but we're working on it.
Yeah. Relatively healthy, yeah.
Relatively healthy physically.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Curt and Katrina have an amazing story. And what I'd like to do is to go back in time. And if each of you could tell me about your early years, where were you born, for example? How did you grow up? And we'll take it step by step from there. So, Katrina, why don't we start with you? What about you? What's your background?
Yeah, so my mother is from Finland and my father's from the UK. And they met in graduate school in Boston, Massachusetts. And I was born in London, but I was 3 weeks old when I got on my first plane and went to West Africa, to Sierra Leone. And then I was 3 when we moved after my younger sister was born to Papua New Guinea. And both my parents are Christians. My mother came to faith later in life. And my father had previously been a bush doctor up in the highlands of PNG. And after they got married, they continued that work in health and in public health, working overseas, and they raised my sister and I overseas. We then, as I went into my secondary school, we moved to the US, back to Massachusetts. And that's where I finished up my schooling before going on to university in DC, and ultimately then from there sort of venturing out to Afghanistan in the first instance, where I got to meet Curt.
Fantastic.
The race through.
A missionary.
So where am I from? I have no idea.
Yeah. That's amazing. That's amazing. So your parents were doing medical work, like as bush doctor type of deals. That's quite hectic, isn't it?
So that's originally what Dad was doing. And then after graduate school, he moved into the public health side of things. Yeah. And so he was training community health extension workers and was particularly working on issues around maternal and child healthcare. So looking at issues around maternal and infant mortality, how to extend health services into rural communities. And then my mother was working on the kind of public health policy side of things, really looking at how to support and come alongside governments and thinking around how to manage their human resources around healthcare, as well as sort of their broader structures and systems and policies around extending healthcare to the most vulnerable within these countries that were underserved and oftentimes had very limited resources as well as limited capacity. So I oftentimes joke that I grew up as a development brat, and I had the real joy, and I think that links into Curt's story as well, of growing up with parents who had a very deep understanding of mission, as not necessarily meaning vocational ministry, but rather really looking at the professional calling that God had given them and the talents that they had to use, and exercising that both professionally as ministry, as well as kind of within the communities that we grew up with.
Fantastic. And Curt, how about you?
Well, I was born in Canada, in the middle of the wintry plains of Alberta. My parents were going to Bible school. So my dad was a missionary pilot with Mission Aviation Fellowship. Yeah. So we then went down when I was 2 years old to Costa Rica and then to Ecuador. So I grew up in the shadow of Elizabeth Elliot and the 5 Christian workers that were martyred there. One of whom was Nate Saint, who was a Mission Aviation Fellowship pilot. So I grew up in his house. I knew his widowed wife and his sister. I also met, as a child, I met the one of the, actually a couple of the men who had killed the five, who had come to faith. And so as a child, it was a very powerful lesson for me that there's beauty that comes from ashes. So, and growing up in Ecuador on the edge of the Amazon was a child's delight, with wild animals and ant hills and, you know, all of those fun things to do. And getting to fly with my father all over the place. So from there, we then went to New Guinea.
Before you go to from there, you know, one of the things that was moving for me, I remember going to MAF, Mission Aviation Fellowship headquarters when it was still in Southern California, and they'd recovered the remnants of the plane, which I'm sure you've seen, with the machete marks in the frame. Quite something, and then I had the opportunity to meet Steve Saint, which was, I'm sure you know him. Wonderful. So just an amazing story. So for people,
we had the joy a couple of years ago bringing our kids there.
Oh, you did?
Walking them to the MAF headquarters
in Idaho. Now it's in Idaho.
And walking them through, showing them exactly that wreckage and walking them through that story and being able to connect that back to their legacy as well. And, you know, you'll hear a little bit more around our story, but this sort of lesson around really growing our kids up in that faith and knowledge that God is faithful, even in those hard spaces.
And the story for us too, of being in Afghanistan eventually, which is later in our story, of losing a lot of friends, and being able to go back to that, in a sense, for me, to understand God's sovereignty and his plan and the beauty. So I moved from there to the island of New Guinea. So I was on the western half of New Guinea, which belongs to Indonesia. So it's called Papua. And again, was right in the middle of beauty coming out of tragedy. Again, just before we had gotten there, two of the missionaries had been killed. If you're familiar with the book Lords of the Earth, there were two that were killed. They were, cut up and eaten to desecrate their bodies. So, and then a few months later, an MAF airplane crashed in the valley where these two missionaries had been killed. And that airplane, there was only one survivor, a 10-year-old boy named Paul Newman, who I've met, and he survived. And by God's amazing grace, he wound up, the path that he took away from the crash was a path that led right by the hut of a man that God had begun to work on, and who felt bad about the death of these two missionaries. And that man saved Paul from the rest of the tribe. And in the end, they asked for the missionaries to come back in. 5 years later, my father, who was a pilot and also a helicopter pilot, was taking national missionaries from that valley into new areas where they were actually putting their lives on the line. So for me as a child, it was beautiful growing up in those kind of places, and set me up really, I think, for a life of working in difficult places and being able to really trust in the sovereignty of God.
Wow. Amazing, amazing, amazing. So, Curt, did you then come and study in the US, or?
Yeah, I came back to the States and studied electronics engineering. You know, my dad being a pilot, again, like Katrina's parents, whereas that he was a Christian worker, but he was a professional. And so I loved engineering. I loved business. And so understanding that as a business person, I could see that as a spiritual gift, entrepreneurship as a gifting from God to be used for his glory, to be used as hands and feet. So it was really, I look at that as a beautiful preparation for the life that I have chosen and that we have chosen together.
Great. So take me into, both of you end up in Afghanistan, and I know that, that can, each of that can, so you didn't go in there together, right? You went in separately.
No, definitely not.
And so you went in separately, and so Katrina, what were you doing there?
So I should paint the picture of when we first got to know each other and sort of how far away our worlds were from one another. I'm a number of years younger than Curt, and so when I arrived, this was sort of my first foray professionally, and back in overseas, but my first sort of real foray into development work properly. I had previously been working in Washington DC on programs around sort of inner city community development and working on programs around gangs and that sort of thing. Now, finally, I was finding myself overseas. And I think when we first met, if I'm not wrong, I was working for an Afghan NGO. So I bought my first ticket out to Afghanistan after having been offered a job in Costa Rica and turning that down. I think largely because I thought, I was tired of people saying that I wouldn't be able to hack it. And so I thought, well, I'm going to prove it to them by going to the hardest place that nobody will ever be able to say anything. And I do remember the guy saying, well, just think of me when you're cold in the middle of the Kabul winter. You could be sitting on a beach and drinking margaritas. Which was definitely what happened that first winter. And so I arrived, I bought my first ticket out to Afghanistan. I volunteered with an Afghan NGO for the first 3 months. I learned the language, which was such a privilege, and I got to travel, on public transport, on horseback, rumbling across roads.
So she's a real development person, hardcore development.
I had sort of hair down to my down to my hips, a ring in my nose, and I was constantly wearing sort of Pakistani traditional Afghan clothes. And meantime, Curt was one of the first 8 directors who was sort of setting up this billion-dollar telecoms company. And
very different worlds.
We could not have been sort of more in contrast to one another.
So back in the 70s, there were a long line of dope smoking hippies who went to Afghanistan before you, back and forth. Right?
I may have fit in well.
She was, other than the dope, she was like that.
She was dope. Yeah. She didn't do dope, but she was dope.
Yeah, she was,
Fantastic.
So it was, her father had been already there in Afghanistan doing maternal health. So I met him at the International Church before I met Katrina.
Very Afghan.
So very Afghan, meet the father, meet the parents. So anyway.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. So I've missed something. Where did the black high heels come into the high heel boots? Come into this?
Famous story.
I still have the yellow ones that came later, sitting in the other room. Yeah, so we met at the International Church in Kabul. And yes, the famous story is that the first sort of proper recollection of one another that we have was love that we're doing this publicly on a podcast, was that I walked into church and I saw Curt sat on the front row, and I must have known who he was because I remember thinking, Curt Laird sat on the front row. Fine. And so I sort of made my way up there and I sat down next to him, and I used to wear these sort of comically inappropriate for Afghanistan black leather stiletto boots. I mean,
I love boots.
How this went with my Pakistani, wardrobe, I'm still not entirely sure. And it was certainly not particularly appropriate for sort of the, rubbly dirt roads of Afghanistan. But this is what I wore. I had these black leather stiletto boots, and I sat down next to Curt, and I remember crossing my legs, and Curt did this. Oh, nice boots.
You have to remember that women really dress down. Expat women really dress down in Afghanistan, and they're often wearing long, flowing, and everything. And Katrina was one of these that just kind of broke the mold. And those black stiletto boots were like, wow, that was like a breath of fresh air. But after I did that, I suddenly realized I was in church and it was very inappropriate, I felt, and that she might really think that I was kind of coming on to her, and I was embarrassed.
Yeah.
And so afterwards, I wrote her an email and I was like, I just want you to know that, I'm not coming on to you. I was really trying to pull back my words.
And I was really disappointed because I thought, oh, right, okay. So I left it at that. I mean, as far as I was concerned, then Curt had he had made himself very clear and it was very complimentary, but there was nothing there.
So we missed each other.
So I think we missed each other for another, 6 years?
Yeah, 5 years, I think.
5 years. So he didn't take the boot bait. Well, he did, but then he realized. He realized it, and
then he took it back. It was a catch and release type situation.
That's what it was, catch and release.
So the other thing too was, so I was in my early 40s at the time.
Yeah.
And Katrina was in her mid 20s. Well, that at that age is a big gap.
Yeah.
And I had started coming to the realization that I might not get married, and when you choose a life of, in a sense, obedience to going to the difficult places, there's a potential sacrifice. There is a sacrifice. And so you have to really be ready, because aligning those visions to find somebody that will journey with you it's a miracle. It's a miracle. And thankfully we believe in a God of miracles, but
but it's almost like you have a default set with a set to neutral, at least not to it might not happen, and so I don't want to jump the gun, and I don't want to be overly and what's the probability that a cute lady shows up and then oh my gosh, you've got all the normal Christian constraints, there's big age differences, but just also being careful and not doing stuff to mess up your calling and so forth.
Yeah, and I think for me, I had dated before. I dated one gal, it was a wonderful Christian gal, and she said to me, Curt, I will follow you anywhere. And that to me was that was not what I wanted to hear. Yeah. Because I knew that where I was called was difficult, and I wanted a partner who would go with me, who had their own calling, so that when things and I got discouraged, that she would have that calling. When she was discouraged, I would have that calling, and there would be that joint. I didn't want somebody following me. I didn't want to follow somebody else. I wanted to go together. And to find that really demands that you trust God that it's there, or that it's not there and he's meant you to be single for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We've been doing some premarital counselling as a part of our church community here. And one of the things that I think we've found ourselves increasingly talking to younger couples about as they're preparing to sort of embark into a life of marriage and partnership is actually the importance of being really clear around what is the reason that the Lord has brought you two together in this time and space in history. It's not simply about you having companionship. It's not about you procreating and making sure that the world is filled with human beings. It's about there is mission and purpose, and for you as a couple, as well as you as individuals. And that means being really invested in one another's callings, but it also means, I think, really taking the time to examine and to explore actually what is it that the Lord is doing in and through this partnership that is unique and that becomes your guiding star. Because I think for both of us, I mean, it's been a journey. It was 6 years that we missed each other. It was 6 years where the Lord had a lot of prep work for us, and not just in the goofy ways of me being development and him being, private sector capitalist pig, right? But really looking at drawing our visions and our desires and our articulation of that together and beginning to plant in us a seed of something new that God wanted to birth through bringing this partnership. And in the end, that actually was the basis around which we wrote our vows. And so our wedding vows were the result of us praying about that and sort of promising to one another to walk together into that sort of joint sense of mission.
So I have two questions for you there. Do you think if he hadn't, done the catch and release and all of a sudden thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to be written up by the elders for hitting on the 25-year-old with the black boots. Do you think if you'd sat down at that point, had a second cup of coffee and so on, you would have been ready to discover a joint calling?
No.
Absolutely not.
No, it's no question. For me, one of the things that had been successful for me in going in buying my own business, and starting a business was also the things that we often say, what gets you here won't take you there. Right. And what got me there, successful, type A, really driven, focused, very truth oriented, was something that was not well suited to marriage and to relationship. It wasn't that I needed to not be truth oriented. It was that I needed to take that and move it to the side for the sake of relationship. And so in those intervening years, I went through a very intense leadership training program, which really got down into the mindset level, the limiting mindsets of leaders. And you as a leader, recognizing those limiting mindsets. And so that has not only made my business career and success blossom to take me to the next level, but it also prepared me to marry somebody who was very different. Even though we have the same color of skin, we grew up in the same island. We're third culture kids. But when I married her after a few weeks, I thought, oh dear, I've married a communist. I'm sure that I've married a communist. We did not spend a lot of time together. And I think that was God's, in our case, it was probably God's intervention that we didn't spend too much time. So we fought because I was coming from very much kind of conservative individualism, entrepreneurship, and Katrina was coming much more from the Finnish social democracy, development. And in those early years, we fought like crazy, but as we fought, we just got closer and closer to what we believe is much more of the holistic shalom view of the economic engine, the social development heart working together. I wouldn't have been ready for that at all when I slobbered over her boots.
There we go. You can only lick boots for so long, and then
that's right.
I will say though that my last 2 weeks in Afghanistan as a single person before I then went back married to Curt, I went on holiday with my aunt, who is brilliant, and came out and did 2 weeks of holidaying around Afghanistan with me. And we bumped into Curt at a kind of hilltop cafe restaurant in Western Afghanistan. And we said hi, and I introduced him. And I remember walking away and saying to my aunt, that is one of those guys, it just makes no sense that he's still single. And so even then, whilst, honestly, I mean, our worlds were so different, and both of us had a lot of being broken and a lot of growing up and being softened, I think, to, that the Lord needed to do in each of us in those intervening years. I still had such a clear sense of sort of the caliber and quality of man that Curt was, and the integrity of him as a person, and the ways in which he served and loved Afghans. And so I sort of recognized that. And several years later, my aunt was then there when Curt asked me to marry him, which was a lovely sort of bringing the circle round.
So Katrina and Curt, there's hope for people who are 39 or 40 or something, and there are still good men and women out there from your perspective.
Yes, absolutely. And it can be a struggle. It can be a struggle. It can be a sense of like, are you hearing my heart, Lord? I have a heart to be in a partnership, in a relationship. Are you hearing it? Do you care? And I think that it really needs to throw us back onto the sovereignty of God and to his love, that he does have a plan. And that plan doesn't always include marriage. We have friends who honestly have been able to serve better in more difficult and tricky situations because they were single. Yeah. And yet, even in that, there often is a longing. And so there is this part of like, we are temporarily, we're strangers in this place, and we have to fall back. And the thing for me, I think, is in that loneliness, in those questions, my charge, my encouragement is don't compromise. Do not compromise your vision, your calling. I've seen too many people who have gotten sidetracked with their calling because they married somebody whose calling was completely different. And I think they got taken out of the game. Yeah. And I just think don't compromise. Fall back on the sovereignty of God in the loneliness, in the questions.
The number of people who I know, particularly men, who said, I'll come back once I'm married.
Yeah.
Not a single one of them.
They don't. Like it's like the business guys who say, I'll give money when I make a lot of money. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I do think that this thing around sort of, there is hope. There is hope. There is hope for partnership, and there's hope for intimacy. And that may come through marriage. And it may come through intimate, deep, special relationships and friendships. And it may come through the intimacy of the Lord, or some combination of all of that. But intimacy and partnership and a sense of belonging, that there is hope for that. Yeah. And I should say, I feel this is really important, is like, Curt does not fulfill my needs for partnership perfectly, for intimacy, right? For all of those sort of longings of friendship and sharing and companionship and belonging. And I don't think Curt's meant to, right?
He's a capitalist. I mean, how,
and I adore my husband, and he's my best friend, and he's absolutely my partner in life. And there is a place that only the Lord knows.
Yeah.
And to be frank, there's a place that my girlfriends know.
Yeah. Which there should be.
Friendship and community of walking those things out. So I think there's somehow just a really careful nuance in the midst of that. The Lord has been gracious to us. I'm so grateful that I get to walk this with Curt. I'm so grateful I'm in a marriage with somebody who walks the same path with me into difficult places. And who understands, and I'd be lying if I think either of us said there aren't days where, stuff kicks off in Afghanistan, and both of our reaction is like, if I was single, I'd go. If I didn't have kids, like I'd be on the next plane. Yeah. And we will go if the Lord asks us.
Yeah.
As a married couple, and we will go with kids, because we had our kids in Afghanistan. And we stayed, and we left only when the Lord sort of really directed us out. Right. But there are things that singleness does give you that marriage doesn't.
So don't compromise. Don't compromise.
Yeah, I think this is a really important thing, because there is a bit of a trade-off. While I can go for this joint collaboration and hold out for it, but it might not happen.
Yeah.
Or I quote unquote settle, or I go for companionship, or I go for, for something less than calling. It's very interesting, because I know that marriage is a calling, right? So it's not that marriage isn't a calling, but you left us fighting in your first few years of marriage. Tell me how you went through the process of of discovering a joint calling. I mean, obviously you've got backgrounds and passions, and at a high level, 100,000-foot, love God, serve people. Yeah. But now it's the two of you together with different backgrounds and so forth, and they're working out of a joint calling, even though it's not like you work for the same company and you have the same P&L and all of that. So talk a bit about that.
The thing I think for us was, for me, was seeing the sides of the gospel, in a sense, of the fullness and the holistic, the shalom, the wholeness and completeness of the gospel. And that actually I had been looking at it from one perspective, from the business, from the economic engine, from personal responsibility, from choices, break down the barriers kind of thing, and that's part of the picture, and that is part of the picture. But I wasn't seeing the other side of the holistic gospel, which is the relationships, the community, the systemic injustices and the systemic issues that need to be looked at. And when Katrina started talking about that, the vocabulary she was using and the vocabulary I was using was just clashing. And I'm just like, you don't believe in personal responsibility? And she's like, you don't believe that there's community and systemic issues that we've got to deal with? And man, we just fought.
You love that our biggest arguments around like economics,
yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a big deal, right?
Yeah, so I think a big part of it, the first thing is, and I love that way of putting it, I don't think you've ever put it that way, sort of seeing the gospel from different angles. Big part was beginning to define our terminology.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, that was the first step, was and to be frank, having to do that because I was suddenly married to him. There was no escape clause. There's no like escape hatch, which was terrifying at certain points, because we really did wake up at a certain point, I think, early in marriage and kind of go, what have I done?
What can I do here?
But having to push past that to begin to define terminology, and in that beginning to really move past our trigger points, to really seek to understand. So to listen to understand, and to listen to see actually what was the heart that was being communicated. Right. And that really was that very early stage of that process where I think we began to glimpse, and that was the hope where we sort of began to sort of seep our way out of this, was, oh, this is somebody who at the very, very core shares a deep calling and a burden from the Lord for the things on God's heart, as they relate to these places. And so I think from that space, that became this sort of anchoring point. And then it's been a long journey of, I think, to be honest, of both of us, to some degree, just both on the one hand becoming increasingly dissatisfied, disenchanted with what our own piece of the puzzle has to offer into that vision and into that calling and into that burden. So for me, really looking at the development sector and increasingly feeling that this is a broken and corrupt sector that is unable to really come alongside in ways that are sustainable and dignified to support communities to be risen out of poverty in ways that aren't just sort of hand to mouth, but really develop dignity and wholeness and shalom. And for Curt, it was around seeing that the private sector actually was, had a lot to offer, but also was fundamentally not addressing social ills, wasn't using the fullness of its capability and influence to be able to unlock some of these issues that actually it was perfectly placed to do. And so amusingly, at some point, Curt laughs that he loves when he hears me sort of waxing lyrical now about the private sector.
Private sector, I'm like, wow.
Because, and likewise, we what's funny is that now quite often in conversations, we'll find ourselves speaking and communicating the other person's side of the argument, the other part of that gospel, because I think we've begun to see is, I mean, I love that way of putting it, sort of the gospel reads from multiple spaces. And that over time, the Lord has sort of used all of that journey to really birth for both of us a much more crystallized vision of what that looks like in practice, and where we feel like we're sort of building towards as a joint endeavor and way of serving.
And so this is the encouragement of two single people who love Jesus. When God brings them together in their uniqueness and the right time and the right space for his glory and for his kingdom, there's a beauty. But if we short circuit it by choosing too soon or choosing wrongly and not being patient, we're short-circuiting the beautiful combination. And so for us, our vision is coming together where very soon we are in the process of creating this economic engine, this organization that will have the economic engine and the social development that will be strategically aligned. And so that is the culmination of our marriage and the battle, in a sense, that has come together to see this is what we believe is the shalom model that God is asking us to do in impact investing and in economic and social development. So it's a beautiful thing, but you can easily short circuit it.
Yeah, and it sounds like both of you had to slay the dragons in your own sector, or at least recognize, there are some weaknesses, just as there are in education, healthcare, whatever. In the nonprofit sector, the business sector, you have to say, this is okay, this is the world I come from, but there are flaws, there are issues, and we have to not be in defense of where we've come from, otherwise we won't discover something. Yeah, very good. And in many respects, the journey you've been on, which sounds a bit like a journey of convergence where these things are all coming together, you've had to overcome it in your own life before you can overcome it for others in the marketplace. You've had to eat your own dog food, right?
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
And there's the power there, right? Because then what you're proposing to investors, into communities, sustainable businesses that actually care for the communities, it's coming out of your own story, not just, I read this in a book.
And we saw, and for both of us, we saw external to us, we have lived, I would say from childhood, we have lived the failures of frontier market interventions or investment or social development. We have seen so many failures. Afghanistan was such a failure, as we can see, which just grieves our hearts, because we have Afghan family who are still there in danger. We have lost, tens of friends who have been assassinated by the Taliban and have died in the process of this, and it's been a failure. And so there is this, born out of that is this deep desire to do something different, to, in a sense, deconstruct the way it's been done on both sides and bring that into a holistic. We should not be fighting the economic development, business, and social development, health. We shouldn't be fighting. It's not a battle that Jesus is happy with. We should be working holistically. So,
would you guys mind? Go ahead.
No, sorry. I was just going to say, I think the thing that I still struggle with in communicating this to sort of other audiences who haven't been along on this journey is, obviously this is born, as you said, we've had to slay our own dragons and come along on that journey. And much of that was because there was no escape hatch. So we had to stay in the mud together. And yet the thing, so on one hand, there is continuing to be this sort of sometimes a challenge of saying, actually, we really do. We both worked in these sectors for so long that we've seen the failures. We also have a sense of what does work and where things could work if we were allowed to do them properly, and like if we were unhinged from some of the constraints. But more than all of that, I just find that, I'll be honest, oftentimes in the Western church, I do not sense that same sense of urgency. And this is what grieves my heart more and more, is just this sense of like, we don't get to wait. Today, tonight, there are people who are going to bed with empty stomachs. Children who, are being horribly abused just so that food can be put on the table. There are massive injustice, and there's an opportunity for us as the church to be these incredible sort of apostles of shalom into this world, and that's what we're called to do. And I do have moments where I want to rattle the cages and kind of go, now is the moment. And I don't always feel like that's a message that's easy or welcome, or finding those ways. And again, it goes back to our early days. How do you find language? How do you find language that is an invitation for people, as much as it is a conviction?
I think that's a big deal when it comes to the investment side, which I know you guys are working on, because just as you've had to bridge the capitalist and the communist city, just as you've had to do some of that stuff, bridging Western Christianity into emerging market Christianity, it's a huge thing. And particularly when it comes to investors who have a short fuse deal by deal. It's not that they don't love Jesus, and it's not that they don't want to deliver.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but the mindset shift and requiring a new language and some good models that actually work. I wonder if you could unpack just a little bit about, because you mentioned that Afghanistan was a failure and it was a problem. You've obviously spent time reflecting on this. Could you unpack a little bit what didn't work and what could have been done differently? I know it's a big question, but just what would you do differently if you guys could do some things differently all over again, what it might be, or what could have been done differently?
Yeah, for me, I've come to the conclusion, and I was there from 2002, so right after the Taliban were ejected, and I was there 13 years, and so I worked, through the whole thing, through the surge, through all of that up to 2015, and I'm convinced that it was not a military failure primarily. It was not a social development primarily. There were good things that happened. Katrina's father was really involved. I mean, education went up, health went up, life expectancy went up, and there was a lot of hope. But what was never developed was entrepreneurship, economic development through entrepreneurship. What happened, and again, I was there from the very beginning, so I saw this was that economic development was given to USAID, to DFID, to donor kind of and nonprofits, and they don't know how to do sustainable economic development. What they do has importance, creating systems, but within USAID, I met almost no entrepreneurs. And so policy and programs are being developed that never truly create value. And if you don't create value, and if we didn't start creating economic value creation from 2002, you see what happened when the Taliban took over. Everything collapsed. Everything economically collapsed because it was a Potomkin village. It was a facade. It was never developed. And if you give that economic development to people who don't understand it, they will do what they're good at. They have good intentions, but we never did create value creation. And I think that is something that we have to really look at. We keep blaming military, but the military did what they were supposed to do. They cleared the Taliban out. They protected it for years, but it was never filled. Then the economic development through entrepreneurship, that economic engine, now you start putting the institutions on that. They start demanding laws. They start demanding security. They start demanding all of those things.
This is a really critical point, right? Is you can look at lots of the other things that became sort of next generation failures, and there's elements of the broader strategies that, you know, I would argue were really misaligned, even in terms, I mean, I would even argue in terms of sort of some of the military strategies or the security strategies. Having said that, the thing is that if you begin to develop a private sector, and here we need to talk about sort of value creation. So please don't give me another like little girl's handicraft.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not talking at that level. I'm also not talking necessarily only about that high level that is, you know, multi tens of millions sort of huge level, right? There's that middle class, that SME base that's about, you know, it is then that engine of job creation. It is that engine of value and addition, right? And here's the thing, eventually, there's plenty of parts of Europe that are still working on that. But eventually it becomes a tax base, but it also becomes a place where you have women and men who are beginning to make different sorts of decisions around where to spend their money. And so that has next effects on healthcare. It has effects on education. It has effects on security, because suddenly you've got influential people who are saying, well, hang on a minute, I don't want that. You know, I don't want that drug deal happening, or I'm not comfortable with the Taliban being here because I need a consistency of security that means that I can trade well, right? So it's through this, it's very often, I think we think of these things as sort of these compartmentalized elements of the plan, but fundamentally, if people have that sort of income generation and value generation that is meaningful, alongside, and this is the one other thing that I will say, alongside a genuine engagement that understands and appreciates in a humble manner the culture into which you're working. Because I would say that's the other thing that we failed on. Fundamentally, so much of the engagement was driven by a huge Western hubris. And we, you know, there are examples of places where people took time to just stop and to understand and to develop relationships and to begin to look at how to mold and to adapt our approaches to a context in such a way that it made sense for Afghanistan, but also that began to help Afghans to see new possibilities and to craft their own visions for the future. But those were too few.
So a couple of key points you raise, which is, and this we've seen for years, non-profit doesn't give birth to for-profit, seldom does. Aid organizations, etc., government organizations, they can have all the money in the world, but it's the DNA. You know, you get the DNA from the parents, and it's you know, non-profit doesn't give birth to for-profit. Well, in fact, sets up a dependency mindset, just perpetuates that, and then all of the baggage, bureaucracy, and everything that goes with it. Then the other thing, I love your point, is about the mid-market sector. Because, you know, the big oil companies will get the multi-billion-dollar deals, or the security companies will get those things. But at the and it's not even the low-level one lady with a cow or sewing machine stuff. You know, it's that mid-market sector that can create jobs, that can instill an entrepreneurial mindset within the people, which is a biblical mindset, but because we're made to create, we're made to produce, and so on. So I love that. That's a great observation.
So it's interesting. A marketing guy, American, said to me, we often think that society creates heroes, but actually heroes create society. And he said, show me a country's heroes, and I will show you where that country's going. And so what I started to do in Afghanistan was, I started from the early days. I would ask them, to the Afghans, who are your heroes? And in the early days, they would have a baffled look. They couldn't even think of any heroes, because of course it had civil war and the Taliban. Maybe they would choose a historical. A few years later, they would start to have maybe a musician, maybe a cricket star, maybe a government person. I never once did they tell me an entrepreneur who was their hero.
Very interesting.
And that tells me that when you don't have heroes to look and aspire after in the entrepreneurial space, you will not have that as a place that you look, where your children and your daughters and your sons go towards, and therefore you will start looking at entertainment or politics or government jobs, and you don't value those creations. So I think, so one of the things that we've really been looking at is how do we identify the heroes, the entrepreneurial heroes, and magnify them, get behind them, don't get in front of them, get behind them to help raise them up so that people can look and say, that's who I want to be.
Yeah. And Katrina, are you looking for heroes that are having an impact on society? Is that's part of your lens, or could impact society?
Yeah, but I don't think that, I suppose the way that we're moving in this space increasingly is that not looking at those two things as separate.
Quite correct. No, I'm talking about business heroes who could impact society. I mean, in other words, when you...
Yes. And
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, yes, 100%.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, the beauty and the joy to being here in Kenya, and the gift that it's been to be here, is actually beginning to see some extraordinary Kenyan entrepreneurs who have such a deep, genuine desire to use their platform in business to have a positive social impact, and who are doing that through incredibly creative ways. And some of them, you know, would benefit from having a bit more support to kind of come alongside and help them think through, okay, what does that look like to really maximize your impact? Because they're entrepreneurs, right? They're business people. They're not necessarily social development entrepreneurs. And I love this concept of, you know, increasingly one of the things that I'm looking at is how do you develop social development entrepreneurs as well. But, you know, there is this space of really exciting and just creative, energized entrepreneurs who have a deep desire and longing to see their work have a social impact in communities throughout Kenya, who have a deep love of God, and who every single one of them is crying out to investors to say, just come on this journey with me and be patient enough, because it's going to take a bit more time. But like, here is the opportunity. And that, I have to say, has been such a shot of energy, you know, and particularly because now I'm working in Somalia. So my day-to-day work is in a context that's not very dissimilar to Afghanistan. And it's disheartening. And so to glance across and to see some of the work that we're getting to sort of begin to do, and the partnerships we're getting to begin to create with these business people here in Kenya it's just such a, you can read it in my face. It's such a joy.
Yeah, and the invitation that we give even to people who are listening, the invitation is to join into this kind of effort, not just what we're doing. It's much bigger than us. There's a movement that's happening, and Brett, you are one of the fathers of this movement, and I honor you. I've known of you for many years, and I've known you for only a couple, but you're one of the fathers of this. This movement of saying, look, the body of Christ and the giftings and the resources that are across the world can be brought together in this shalom catalytic movement. It's coming, and if we don't get on the train, you're going to get left. So jump on it, not you, but you know, the listeners. There's exciting things going on, and at times it's like, oh, when is the body of Christ in the West going to rise up and get out of their myopic view of politics and political power and, you know, all of this stuff, and look much bigger? So
there's a new movement that is being birthed. I mean, we really sense it. Like, this continent is where the Spirit is moving, and new things are being birthed, and there's such a sense of excitement to get to be here at this moment in history.
Amen.
So you've just answered one of my second last question, which was, in fact, my last question. My second last question was going to be, I hear a caution in what you're talking about in terms of real value creation. And I don't want to knock a whole movement, although why stop now? No, but I mean, years ago, I wrote a paper called Beyond Businesses Missions, because the problem with even the concept of businesses missions or business for transformation, we give it other things. It's kind of like the missionary habit dressed up in a business versus a real value adding, meeting a contextually relevant need that God cares about with what you have. There's with no separation between businesses missions, not business funding missions. So I hear what you said earlier, right?
We were years ago asked to come and to speak on businesses missions to a particular sending agency, and we joked that we were never invited back.
We never got the chance.
Because we really set this out as a real challenge, and to be frank, both of us, well, I'll speak for myself, but I think you would agree, have a real sense that there is deep hypocrisy. And actually, there can be spiritual sin in an approach that goes out and uses business, false business, as a platform for being able to create relationships, but creates disingenuous relationships as a result. And to be frank, in some closed countries, it's a facade that everybody sees. That you're either knows. The CIA or you're a missionary. So it doesn't work, right? And yet there is, I think for us, there is this real sense of actual business's mission is meet a real economic need and a real social need that is there through effective business practice, and do it as a Christian. And we have the joy of having grown up where that sacred secular divide isn't something that we assume. And we oftentimes say it's much easier to make a business person a missionary than a missionary a business person.
100%. Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, so last question, which you've answered, was going to be, but I'll give you a chance to take another crack at it, was you guys could be, I won't say fat, dumb, and happy, but you could be really successful in the US. There's a ton you could do. You could do that. Why Africa? And I've got my own answer on that, but I'd love to hear from you guys just to reiterate. Okay, so, do you guys, do you just go from frying pans into fires? It just seems like as you move around from here, I first met you, Curt, in Abuja, and you were dealing with all sorts of issues there, Katrina, as well. And now you're back in Africa, which has, average age of 19 to 20. You've got this burgeoning community. You've got all sorts of issues going on, unstable governments, some stable, some this and that. Why are you where you are?
Can I take a crack at this one?
Sure.
So I think my answer is twofold. The first is, and you might not be surprised to hear us say this, but is obedience. We were made for this. Fundamentally, Curt and I were both built for this life. This is what gives us joy. God's grace is upon us to do this. And we have a real clear sense that this is what the Lord has asked us to do. And so our first answer is always it's obedience. I think my second answer, though, is joy. I have such a sense. We had somebody visiting recently, and we went through a tour of introducing them to all of these entrepreneurs and really giving them a sense of what was happening here on the continent and this part of the continent. And he left and said, "Oh my goodness, it's like China in the early 80s. This is where it's happening." And there really is this sense of I sort of keep feeling like we just need to strap in, buckle up, because the train is moving. And that's so exciting, and it gives such joy. And God's grace is in us in this space. So, my second answer to that question is this is where I see God moving, and it's such a delight to get to be a part of that.
Yeah. Fantastic. I think for me also is there's two things. The sense that what God has gifted you, if you're sitting in America, that has gifted you to do across a whole range of things, there are lots of people who will never be able to go because of all kinds of circumstances. They'll never be able to go. If you are healthy, if you are of right mind, and you are a believer, go to where the need is. I look at Seattle, which is one of the most unchurched places in the U.S. There's a church on every square mile, square kilometer. There's radio, there's all of these things, there's Christian business associations, there's all of this. Why do we keep over-resourcing the places that have so much resource? The excitement that can be when you take your gifting and move it into places that you can be catalytic. We are not coming here as colonialists. We're not coming here as saviors. We're coming here with a gift that God has given us, that we are saying, how can we use this for the gospel? How can we use this to, and the excitement of being part of that is just, we are ruined. Once you start working in places like this, you can't go back. You can't go back because it's like being on the battlefront, and the camaraderie that's there. Yes, it can be difficult. It can be lonely. There are days, even today, I got discouraged thinking about, how do I communicate with investors who don't get it? I got discouraged. But in the end, seeing God working and knowing that my gifting is aligned with that is a beautiful thing. And I want it to be an invitation to people who are sitting there, and God is starting to work in their hearts. He's starting to say, a little dissatisfaction with being in the States in a 9-to-5 job. Listen to the Spirit. Listen to the Spirit, and you contact us. Contact you. We will be glad to walk with you in this.
Yeah. I read an article a while ago about a guy in Silicon Valley saying that we need to stop creating companies that produce goods and services that do for us what our moms used to do, and instead start doing things that would make our moms proud. No more apps to get your dry cleaning quicker, or to skip the line in a restaurant, or stupid first world problems. In Africa, you've got real problems, real needs. You can show up as an average person who's just done okay somewhere else, and with the right heart, you can find a real need that you could address, right? You can throw a stone and hit a need, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, one of the things that I'm increasingly learning is we're being discipled by believers here. There's an offering that we bring, but there's so much that we are being discipled in and being blessed by and growing. And so, it is also oftentimes when we talk about sort of inviting, especially investors, but also business people, along on this sort of journey of partnership with entrepreneurs here, it is this thing around sort of, God has things to do in you. There is a gift here and a promise here for you as well as what you have.
We are being transformed by connecting with Dr. Louis Machogu, with Shiko Gitao. We are being transformed by the connection with an African believer who sees the gospel in a different way and adds to the richness of my...
kind of like a different side of the gospel.
Yeah, it is. And the richness of being able to see the gospel from the African community, it's beautiful. So come join us.
Yeah. Recently, just a quick story, we kicked off a new round of the repurposing business training, and I got the people to introduce themselves. And the last guy was a Kenyan. His name is Enoch. And so I said, Enoch, how did you find us? Well, he said, I saw a talk of yours on YouTube when you talked at Google. Now, this must have been in, 2010 or something. It was a long time ago. And so I emailed you, but I never heard back, he said. So maybe you didn't get my email, but I tried again and again. And then I've met one of your guys in Nigeria, and he put me in. So now I'm in this training, right? And he said, I even had conferences for you to speak at, and that I wanted to invite you to. So I just took some of your talks, and I gave your talks, he said. But at the end,
yes.
He said, at the end, I mentioned you.
Isn't that amazing?
That's beautiful.
So we'll have to go meet Enoch sometime. He's still going through our training. Yeah, so there we go. So yeah, so to the Americans out there, there's probably a Kenyan giving you a talk. You may as well go to Kenya.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Thank you, Brett, for all you're doing. Again, all you've done. You've really spoken wisdom into this, and I know for you, it's been a long journey. I really truly believe that the seeds that you have planted so many years ago, I believe we're going to see in the next 5 years, we're going to see an explosion of something different, something new, that you will be able to rejoice, that will be part of your legacy. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, Curt. Thank you, Katrina. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for sharing your story, and thanks for
inviting us.
Yeah, I think the title of this one, Black Boots in Afghanistan. I don't know to figure it out. But thank you so much, and thanks for taking the time, and greatly appreciate it. And we'd love to come and see you guys, connect with you guys, and
come stay with us.
Karibuni, Kenya.
Yeah, then also just drop me your link so I can put that in, and I can get your contact information out there. And Curt, you've written a book in the midst of all of this some years ago, dealing with culture. You wanted to just tell us quickly about that?
Yeah, I after coming out of Afghanistan and seeing the failures of cultural intelligence, especially, I wrote a book called The Culture Key. And really what I was trying to create was a framework, rather than a do's and don'ts of culture, but a framework that would help people to interpret and work cross-culturally. And at the core of it is the concept that every behavior that we see, whatever culture you're in, whatever the behavior you see, comes from a belief. And that belief is what drives the behavior, but that belief is often going to be different in an Afghanistan or a Kenya or Kazakhstan than the belief in the West. And so we need to be curious about examining those beliefs and seeing where that comes from. And that curiosity and humility of looking at those beliefs will help us to interpret the behaviors in a way that we can work with. So that's the book, The Culture Key, on Amazon.
Ultimately make us more successful.
And make us more successful. Yeah. And
coming alongside entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, guys, thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Brett. Lovely to see you.
Lovely
Talk
to
to you
see
later.
you. Okie dokes. Bye-bye.
Thanks, brother. Bye-bye.